So, welcome back to this week's review of the new FX Hulu series, Shogun. And now we're on the final episode titled, A Dream of a Dream. And like always, this will contain full spoilers. So I'm sure that I wasn't the only one that was a bit let down by this finale. I mean, some of you already hate the show, so your minds are pretty much made up. But for everyone else, it was disappointing mostly in what we did not get to see. And let's not kid ourselves, we all wanted to see a big final battle. But not just any battle, the Battle of Sekigahara, perhaps Japan's most famous battle in history. Instead, we get something else. So the episode begins with John Blackthorne, and he's being smuggled out of Osaka. And he's pretty much being kept alive by the Jesuits. And they made a deal with Mariko and Toranaga, and this was to usher him safely back to the village of Ajiro.
She asked the church to spare your life before she died. And now I have. I have kept my word to her.
But the deal that we discovered later was actually that Einjin's life was in exchange for the ship. And we also find out that Toranaga burned and sunk his ship, and then he blamed it on the Christian spies. You know, always blaming Christians for everything. And it's really in this episode that we finally see just how ruthless of a warlord Toranaga really is. He just brutally cracks down on the villagers. And we see some pretty disturbing imagery of some severed heads, so we know he means business. And we later find out that this is all just some kind of test for John. And he ultimately passes when he offers to take his own life in exchange for the villagers. And in the novel, this scene actually happened much earlier in the story. This is when John first arrived in the village. And it was very similar. He's just about to take his own life in exchange to save the villagers. And then he stopped at the last minute. And in this moment of just being on the edge of life, John has sort of an epiphany. And it was here that John really began to accept the Japanese culture. And even to just cherish life more. And instead, for some reason, this adaptation just saved it for the very last moment. Actually, at the very end of the series. And I believe what they were trying to do is just show that at this point, John is just willing to give up his life after everything he's been through. But majority of this episode is just feeling bad for what happened to Mariko. You know, we see Yabushige, he's just so destroyed over this. Same with Toranaga. John, he'll never be the same. But I honestly felt nothing for Mariko. And it's because she really wasn't that likable. And I don't understand what John even sees in her. I mean, she never smiled. She was only really intimate with him once or twice. And she just wasn't very affectionate. Just very stone-faced. But in the end, she does save John. But for just me watching the show, I just feel nothing for her. So when I see characters upset, I don't get much out of it. But if I actually did care about her, this episode would be a lot more effective. And I do see people on Reddit praising Anna Sawai's acting. So there is people that do like this character. But like with many Hollywood shows now, you get these executives that just want these strong females in these shows and movies. But what they fail to do is make them likable. And I feel like that performance definitely hurt the show, because the show is very much centered on this character. They're even stating that Crimson Sky was really all about what she did. But I will say what this episode did really well was the conversation with Yabushige and Toranaga. And this was actually a character that I was sad to see go. I actually cared about him. And unfortunately, Yabushige dies in this episode, and it's very much similar to how he died in the novel. And I just want to praise Tadanobu Asano. He completely just embodied this character. And he's really just a tragic person. He's stuck in between these two very powerful men that can kill him. And the whole series, he just has to be clever enough to choose a side that will ensure that he survives. But unfortunately, in the end, he ultimately failed. But I don't really see how he could have survived this. If Toranaga didn't have him killed, then definitely Ishida would have. And it was just sad that, he had to go this way. But at least he did get a honorable death. He committed seppuku. And he also had Toranaga as his second. And that's an honor. Though I liked how he joked about dying in a more badass way. Maybe he'd prefer to be boiled alive. But before he commits seppuku, he gets Toranaga to finally lay out his plans. And this is the most that we, the audience, will ever know about his plans as well, as we unfortunately never see them. And it turned out that Crimson Sky that we heard so much about, it changed from being an all-out awesome battle to just simply sending Mariko to Osaka. And this was to change Lady Oshiba's mind. And in turn, this would weaken Ishido's grip on the noble families. But the most fascinating aspect is just these two men talking. They're old friends, more like frenemies, and they've both known each other for a very long time. And they get to say one last bloody farewell. And Yabushige realizes that Toranaga has been planning his rise to power this entire time. And when Yabu begs to know what happens next, Toranaga just grimly replies, "Why tell a dead man the future?" And I really almost wish that Yabushige said, "Why not?" Of course, what makes this scene so good is just these two compelling characters just coming together in one great performance. And this is also the longest scene that we've had with Hiroyuki Sanada and Tadanobu Asano. And it was just great seeing these two legends of Japanese cinema. And they just really pulled it off so perfectly. And the whole series might be worth it just for this one scene alone. Though I will say it would have been better if we could see them duel each other. That would have been insane. They should really just hire me to write it. And we find out that John actually sees through Toranaga's scheming. He doesn't believe for a second that Christians burned the ship down. He knows Toranaga did it. But he comes to the conclusion that it was Mariko, acting alone, who arranged the deal with the Jesuits. And this is rather than Toranaga being the one that's pulling all the strings. And when John tries to commit seppuku, Toranaga stops him, and then he relents on his punishment of the villagers. And he tells John to rebuild his ship, and then to build him an entire fleet. But later we find out when Toranaga tells Yabushige, he actually doesn't believe John will ever leave Japan. And this is actually what happens in the other adaptations. John just gets stuck in Japan.
Was it really given to you by a savage?
But this episode actually begins with a flash forward scene. And we see a future where John is much older, and now he's just this old grandfather in a bed. And we see that he's just thinking back on his time in Japan. And this signifies that his love for Japan never left. And this is definitely a much more hopeful ending, just knowing that eventually John escapes. But still, something just felt off about the scene. And that's probably because of the fact that he's just old and decrepit, and he doesn't look very happy. And there's actually a few of these flash forward scenes, but I just found them kind of odd, and they just seemed out of place. And just because of that, I'd probably just prefer not knowing if he ever made it home or not, much like the original did. And Toranaga also explains to Yawashige why he's kept John alive when there's just been so many opportunities to have him killed. And it's not because he's important, but because he makes him laugh. And he states that it's good to have something to distract our enemies. And the statement is actually kind of meta. It's letting us, the viewers, know that John's character really wasn't that important. And it's almost like they're telling us that they made this change from the novel on purpose.
Yes, this is wonderful.
But I believe that this adaptation was really just trying to avoid having a white protagonist. And it's because they're afraid to be criticized of being labeled a white savior story. But the funny thing is that people are still accusing the show of being that.
Right, you miserable, sniveling, festering shitrags!
But the original novel, and even the 1980 adaptation, they both centered more on the European aspects, but also to some degree the history that inspired the original James Clavell novel. And John Blackthorne is actually based on the real-life English pilot named William Adams. And this was the real-life first Englishman to land on Japanese soil. And he actually became a key advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu. That's who Toranaga is based on. And Adams actually helped train Tokugawa's men, and he trained them with cannons and also assisted in 2 major battles. And one of those battles included the famous Battle of Sekigahara. And this is where Ieyasu overdrew his enemies and rose to power. Very famous battle. So this Englishman was really more important than just a distraction or a clown that this series adaptation makes him out to be.
The purity of a woman!
And also it's worth noting that Adams actually never went back to England. He spent his entire life in Japan and died at the age of 55. But this version really just skipped on the Portuguese drama. And we hardly saw some pretty prominent and big characters like Father Ferreira and even Rodriguez. And in the novel, these were John's main antagonists. And their presence added more danger to John's character. But with the exception of Rodriguez, I actually really liked his character in the older series, especially when he was played by John Rhys Davies. But for me personally, I could do without this whole aspect. I'm not too bummed that they skipped out on most of it. And I do know that some people like the European drama, but I always found it being distracting from the much more interesting Japanese drama that's going on. And I always just found Father Ferreira to just be really annoying.
Who don't have that power?
He's the definition of a cartoon villain. Very over the top, not very believable.
Curse you. Injuries!
And even Father Alvito was like this to an extent. Basically all the Christians were just cartoon villains. So it's really a major positive for at least me that this adaptation skipped all that and toned it down. They did have some of the Portuguese drama in the beginning, but it didn't really go much from there. And I'm glad it didn't. And it's funny because the 1980 series favored the European aspects, and this version in turn favors more of the Japanese. And for some reason we could only have it one way or the other. So now you have to watch both versions to get the full story. Of course you could just read the novel. Or honestly, not even bother, because if you just want the basic story, then you pretty much already got it just by watching the 2024 version. But like I said in the beginning, they really should have given us a big battle scene. At the least, a season finale, but when you're talking series finale, it's almost a must. And the flash forward that we get really just didn't work for me. Not only is it just a flash forward of an awesome battle that we could be seeing, but it's just one that's just being narrated by Toranaga to Yabushige, just explaining to him what will happen. You know, have you ever heard show don't tell? You know, they should just show us the battle. And also, we're just supposed to believe that everything is just gonna fall into place as Toranaga says. You know, by the looks of it, there still is some room for error. And all we get is just a quick shot of the armies. We see them forming battle. And we don't even see Ishido being defeated. All we see is that he gets word that Lady Ochiba has betrayed him. She's not going to back him. And what's insane is there's episodes of just building up this epic confrontation. You know, we've been hearing about Crimson Sky and just the battle between Toranaga and Ishido for multiple episodes. And just to give us nothing, that's, you know, I definitely expected more. And you could argue at least it was unpredictable. You know, it kind of was. Maybe I was just expecting, you know, Lord of the Rings. Or even Game of Thrones, which the show is non-stop compared to. But by the end of it all, I felt a little deflated. Just wishing that there was one more episode to make room for an epic battle. And the actual historical battle of Sekigahara is quite incredible to read about. It involved two armies with very vast numbers. Tokugawa's Eastern Army boasted 75,000 men, while Ishida's Western Army outnumbered them with an incredible 120,000 men. And its outcome resulted in a 200-year dynasty. The battle took place on October 21st, year 1600, and it happened on a morning that was just covered in fog, very much like most of this show. And it was so foggy that neither side could really plan an attack, or even just see where the other army was. But when the fog went away, and the battle finally began, the scale of it was just insane. And the battle's fierce fighting ended in betrayal on Mount Nangu. This is where commander of the Mori army refused to help the retreating Ishida, and he was forced to surrender and later executed. And Tokugawa eventually emerged victorious, and he founded the first Edo shogunate. And this would have been just one hell of an epic hour of television, perhaps the best we've ever seen. Anyway, I still somewhat did enjoy the ending. You know, battle or no battle, it was still beautifully shot, very well made. And I suppose we didn't need to see the battle play out. You know, we still know what happens in the story. And there was some small moments in the episode that I liked. Also, just the beautiful score, the gorgeous costumes, the cinematography. I'm honestly sad that the show is over. Still, just including that key battle just culminating in Toranaga's ultimate victory definitely would have just been so much better. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the episode and the series, and tune in because soon I'll have a full series review. And if you want to discuss more topics, I have a free Discord, and if you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon. Both are in the description below. Anyway, thanks for watching.